It's really great now to welcome Sam Woolford. Sam double degrees in business university, and he's the kind of person we the issue of fishing. So welcome to you.
If we say you want to listen to me, I suggest today. I think our primary mission is fisheries. We want more fish in the water. We want our kids to have better opportunity. We want natural resources so that everybody can have a fair go, and that's particularly for future generations. We're a wholly owned subsidiary of an organisation called the New Zealand Sport Fishing Council. 50 clubs nationwide, 38,000 affiliate members. We're also very much aligned with Yachting New Zealand, Casting and Angling Association and New Zealand Underwater. Now the reason that that's so important and the reason I'm so excited to be here with you guys is because we're all democratically elected. The whole process through the Sport Fishing Council is policy driven. The aligned members get to put forward remits. We get to furiously debate them at AGMs and before it gets processed into the manifesto and the policy that we then go and advocate on behalf of. So I think that's really important that we just outline that we're a significant part of the coastal users, the yachties, the commercial fishers and the sailors. Now, I didn't really know where to begin today because I want to cover quite a lot of ground with you guys, and I thought the best place is obviously to start with some of the issues. It feels like every week at the moment we have a conversation about something else going wrong, whether it's crayfish, scallops. It doesn't really matter. It seems to hit the news every other week. And so this is just an example of some of the recent headlines. We don't seem to have enough kaimoana to feed South Auckland, but we don't seem to have enough scallops to keep the commercial scallop fishery open either. So the one overlying or underlying issue that we keep coming across is the fact that the quota management system, we believe, is fundamentally not fit for purpose. It was established 30 years ago. 1986 was when it was created. And interestingly, at the time, it was established to prevent the ongoing kind of overharvest from the 60s and the 70s. There was no regulation back then. So the idea of the QMS was to actually to create a structure in which commercial fishing had to work within. The reality was, it was one of the biggest privatisations of public resources in post-Muldoon era. It was just after Muldoon left. What it's failed to do is establish proper stewardship and co-ownership. So we haven't seen a priority given to the marine environment. We haven't actually seen a priority given to the natural resources that they were also heavily reliant on. We haven't seen a transition away from destructive fishing techniques. So one of the fundamental issues of the quota management system is that you've got a single species allocation. So the government gives me a ton of snapper. I can then go and sell that or rent it to commercial fishermen, and they can use indiscriminate fishing techniques. So we've got a single species quota management system, but then the same system allows indiscriminate fishing. So from the get-go, we've got an imbalance. The other thing that it promised is that it was actually going to create a high-value, low-impact fishery. So the idea was that, with quota ownership, these private companies would have a vested interest in our natural resources, in our publicly owned natural resources, and therefore they would treat them with respect, and they would actually look to create maximum value from every kilo of fish that is being harvested. The second fundamental issue I just wanted to highlight with you is this idea of over-allocation. So in conjunction with the fact that we've got ongoing indiscriminate destructive fishing techniques, we've got over-allocation. Now, on the left-hand side here, have we got a pointer on this? Oh, look at that. What we've got here on these two graphs, they're very similar, is the bar graph is catch. That's what the commercial fishing industry is currently catching. But then on the top here, the line graph shows what they're currently allowed to catch. Now, there's a key thing here. What you've got to understand about the idea of quota is that it was supposed to constrain commercial fishing. So if you're a commercial fisherman, your job is to take natural resources and convert them into economic income. So the more fish you can catch, the more wealthy you become. It's a simple mathematical equation. The idea with quota is that you're supposed to have a ceiling, a limit, that would regulate or control how much fish is being extracted. Otherwise, we're going to get into over-harvest. In here, what happened back there, 2000, and this is over a couple of decades, so that's 2008, 2009, you start to see the fishery declining. So the moment you see a difference between the allocation and the amount of harvest, you have to ask the question, why? Scallops are great. They're in the supermarket. Everybody loves them. There's clearly a demand for them. So why wouldn't you catch what you're allocated? Because they're not there. So we start to see the first indicators there is the problem. Remarkably, what happens here is a massive boost in quota. Now, they found a new scallop bed. And rather than protecting it and saying it's broodstock, we should actually, prioritise the healthy environment. If we have broodstock, then we can actually have replenishing reproductive natural environments. MPI said, nope, that's great. There's more scallops out there, so we'll increase the amount of fish that you're allowed to harvest, scallops you're allowed to harvest. That happened. They couldn't even harvest what was allocated. Classic over-allocation. But then you see what happens after that. It just dwindles away. So scallops are broadcast spawners. What they do is they actually release the eggs and the spermicide into the water column and they mix in the water. Now they will drift on the currents for up to 6 weeks. So to have a healthy scallop fishery, you've got to have abundance. You've got to have close-knit, dense scallop beds. So in 2014, they decimated the mother bed. They took away all of the productivity from the scallop fishery, and then over the next decade, we just basically fished out the remaining stocks. Bear in mind that we're continuing to use scallop dredging at the same time, so that's the indiscriminate fishing techniques coming back. And what's happening is that as you drag these dredges along the seafloor, they don't just collect scallops, they take everything out. So this is your seagrass, your seaweed, your invertebrates, your crustaceans, your octopus middens. The whole ecosystem is altered by doing this. And what's really alarming is the fact that it leaves a layer of sedimentation, fine sedimentation. Now, when the scallop spat comes to settle, the next cycles, it gets to a certain point where it's about 5 mils and it sinks to the seafloor. Now, that's not big enough to get blown away by a big current, so it actually needs something to attach to. But with sedimentation, there's nothing there. It's like trying to attach to an ice rink. So they get blown away. So every time we drag a dredge or anything along the seafloor, we're harming the ecosystem, which means that the whole benthic environment is altered, meaning that there's going to be less productivity. And we find ourselves in this doom loop. The second one, over here this is bait fish. And the reason I've chosen this one is for a similar reason. That's the allocation line there. So that's what they're allowed to harvest, but over the last 10 years, you can see the trajectory of the fishing. You can only ask why. I mean, the answer is pretty self-explanatory at this point. But the problem is that with a single species quota management system, we're failing to take into consideration the ecosystem-based fisheries, the impacts of fishing on the ecosystem. So jack mackerel, which is this one over here, mackerel are a fundamental food source. They're a forage fish, and they're vital to the ecosystem because what eats a bait fish? Everything. Seabirds, whales, dolphins, snapper, kahawai, everything eats these bait fish. So when you start seeing over-allocation issues like this, it's not just about the fact that we're selling them overseas for $1.80 a kilo, it's about the fact that the entire ecosystem is reliant on the food web, and we're effectively fishing it down. This image, I'll let you have a quick read of that one, actually came out in 2009. It hasn't aged at all, right? It's pretty timeless. The fundamental issue that we have today is the idea of privatisation. And I touched on that a few minutes ago. When we gave away the fishing rights to these private companies, we created an asset class. And what these companies can do is that they can buy and they can sell and they can amalgamate. So now there's about 3 companies in this country that control about 78% of all the quota. So either they own it or they lease it from the small guys that are left, but fundamentally we've got it's a triopoly, a duopoly plus one. And the fishing interests are really powerful. So it's kind of like, the way I try and explain it is, It's like the council saying, okay, we need to build a new road or a bus stop or anything like this. We're going to take your land, we're going to take your garage, and we're going to put the bus stop on your garage. And you go, hang on a minute, I bought this house. There's no way that you can do that. So they've got a really strong case to say that this is not an acceptable behaviour, and if it's not in the interest of the stakeholders, of the quota owners, then effectively better management and reforms always gets pushed away. Daniel Pauly, I'll let you read this one as well. I'm trying not to bombard you with too much information on the screens. I hate it when people do that. So Daniel Pauly is a world-renowned marine scientist, and he has helped us put together an alternative reform package that we're proposing. But I think it's very apt when we think about the natural resources, the privatisation of these resources, and fundamentally what's happening with things like capitalism, trickle-down economics. We know that it doesn't work. And what we're seeing in the fishing industry is people, the fishermen, the guys out on the water, are not being remunerated appropriately for the work that they're doing. They're doing hard work. They have to front all of the costs, putting the fuel in the boats, getting the ice, paying the crew. You know, they've got all the overheads of running a business, but the quota owners get to dictate what the price is. So the organisations like Sanford's, Tallies, these organisations, they don't actually own very many boats anymore. They've amalgamated all of the quota, and they get to lease out that quota. So you get something called an annual catch entitlement. And what happens is that the quota owners will say, you can have a ton of my snapper. You can go and fish it. It's fine. You fish it however you need to be economically viable. I'll pay you $2 a kilo. The most recent one I heard was actually around Kahawai. It was 20 cents a kilo. So these fishermen are getting paid 20 cents a kilo to go out and fish. Now this is a captured market, remember, because these fishermen, these ace fishermen, they're obligated to sell back to the quota owners. That's part of the contractual obligation that they have. So they put all the fuel in the boat, the ice in the boat, they take all the risk up front, they go to sea, and then they come back and they have to sell to these people. So the first thing you're going to do is you're going to do it in the most economically viable way possible, which is predominantly bottom trawling. So the fishermen on the water are actually getting a really raw deal. It's similar to a lot of the farmers, you know, when you put those big organisations over the top of them. So that's the segue back to economics and the similarities between that and fishing. And this brings us into what we're calling a scam. Shane Jones is calling it a reform, but when you look up the definition of reform, it actually alludes to positive, to you know, doing something well-meaning. We can't bring ourselves to use that word, and after an introduction like I had a minute ago, I think it's pretty safe to say that I can speak freely in this room. So what's he proposing? It sounds great. It's 72 pages. It looks like a lot of efficiencies, you know, transitional sort of stuff. It's all watered down and it's really nice and pretty. But when we cut through it, there are 5 things that are really, really alarming. The first one is self-regulation by the sector. So what is happening is these catch entitlements that the commercial industry is allowed to use. So every year they get allocated the catch entitlements. Sorry, I'll start that again. The quota is allocated in perpetuity, so they've got that forever. But every year they can then use those annual catch entitlements to sublease to the fishermen. What they're now saying is that if you haven't caught your fish in your allotted season, you can just take those annual catch entitlements, amalgamate them, and fish them in a future season. So effectively what we're doing is, going back to the over-allocation slide, we're saying, well, geez, if you can't catch all your fish in one season, that's okay. Just amalgamate all of this fishing effort and do it in the future. So if the public, for example, has a reduction on crayfish, if we actually do the right thing and we try and reduce the pressure on our fisheries, they're quietly stacking up annual catch entitlements in the background so that in the future they can just come in and hit them. And that means that any rebound, any sort of productivity gains that we want to try and establish can be wiped out in a single season. The second part is the lack of reliable data. So what's another little issue that slipped through earlier, or sorry, late last year, was the fact that Shane Jones reduced the research levies on quota. So historically they have to pay a percentage of research levies to independent data scientists like Copthorne and Niwa. He reduced that from about $42 million to 36, or 36 to 42. 46 to 32. So what he's doing is he's actually reducing the ability for independent science to establish data and to estimate biomass and the sustainability of fisheries. What we're doing instead is we're increasingly gravitating towards something called CPUE, or catch per unit of effort. And what that means is if the commercial fishermen are working harder to catch fish, then clearly there's a declining abundance, right? It's a relatively simple metric. But you should never ever manage the biomass or the populations of a fish by what has actually been taken out of the water, particularly because we're still using these indiscriminate fishing techniques. And if we're measuring the biomass of tarakihi, we're not actually considering the hapaka or the kahawai or anything else that's being caught in conjunction with that. So CPUE is a very simple, one-dimensional sort of product that they are increasingly going towards because the science sector is being defunded. The other thing to do with CPUE is it's really manipulatable. So the example I like to give is crayfish, functionally extinct out here. Obviously, it used to be a thriving fishery. Great Barrier had a number of fishermen all through the Coromandel Peninsula. We had little fishing boats, and they were an important part to the ecosystem. There were engineers that looked after the boats. There was transportation, logistics that came behind that as well. Over time, that quota has been amalgamated. They're predominantly fishing out of Tauranga now. The problem with CPUE is that as places like Great Barrier have a decline in abundance, the CPUE is going to go up. So the effort's going to get harder. They're going to have to lift more pots to catch crayfish. So the simple answer? They just moved. They moved down to East Cape where there was more crayfish. And they actually managed to maintain the current amount of harvest for another 18 months before the public got involved. And there was a huge outroar because suddenly from East Cape all the way to Great Barrier, Pakiri, there was no crayfish. So relying on commercially orientated data like this, it's manipulatable, it's single dimension, and it can't be reconciled against independent data because that independent data is no longer being funded. The other aspect of that is the transparency issue. So fisheries are publicly owned assets. These natural resources that swim in the ocean, they're our fish, they're the people's fish. And so we deserve to know what a private industry is doing with relation to these publicly owned assets. We're the major shareholders here. We should understand that. We've been battling collectively as the public. We've been battling for about 10 years now to see cameras on boats. And it's interesting that Shane Jones is now the man in charge here because it was his predecessor that was stymieing them in the first instance. The thing with cameras on boats is that when they finally got put on, nothing happened. That data wasn't available. Nobody saw it. It took an OAA, an Official Information Act request, to get that information into public scrutiny. Now, the reason that nobody wanted to talk about this was because it showed a 46% increase in discards. It showed a 900% increase in discards of snapper and kingfish, and was at a 3.6% increase in seabird mortalities. So cameras on boats are not solving the problem. We've still got these indiscriminate fishing techniques that are legalised under the quota management system, but they're highlighting the problems that we currently have. So the fact that Shane Jones is now proposing to remove the visibility or public access to this information is very questionable, because if you can be as transparent as possible, what have you got to hide? I think is the key question. They're kind of trying to make it a nothing to see here scenario. A little anecdote is that I actually took my motorbike to the mechanics the other day, and he did the service and everything. It was great. Rode it home, sweet. Got home the next morning. There's a little bit of oil on the garage floor. So I called him up and I said, "Rich, mate, there's a little bit of oil on the floor. Did you do the oil filters?" He says, "Yeah, I can't remember." And I said, "Okay, well, what should I do?" And he says, "Well, it's probably just a little bit loose. And we just, tighten up. But I'll tell you what, I'll just go back through the cameras in my mechanics workshop and I'll check for you." So he rewound the cameras and he's got them on the bike stand so he can see exactly what he did and what he didn't do. And he's watching through it. I'm on the phone and he goes, "Oh, yep, no, there it is. Yep, filter came out. Yep, there's the new one going in. Just give it a tighten, Sam. I just don't think I tightened it up properly." So for a mechanic, a little one-man shop, having a camera on his axle stand and trying to give that transparency and that comfort to his customers Why is the commercial industry so scared of a little bit of transparency? I'll come back to the wastage, which is point number 4, but the other aspect of this, in conjunction with removing the visibility, is they actually want to limit public consultation processes in future decision-making processes. So the commercial fishing industry stood up with Shane Jones, maybe a month ago now, at a press conference, and they proudly told the entire country, we've spent 12 months coming up with this plan. And in that plan is something called management decisions or management plans. And it would allow the minister autonomy over decision-making processes for up to 5 years. No public consultation. And the main reason that they said that this was a good idea is because it would streamline the processes. Now, we've got 30 years of degradation going on. We've got 30 years of systemic failure right now. It's not about making fast decisions. It's actually about making good, conservative decisions. It's actually about prioritising the health and marine environment over the economic interests of the stakeholders. So removing public consultation from these systems, it's going to work. It's absolutely going to expedite these processes because the only stakeholders that are resistant to exporting more fish are the public. So you've kind of captured the whole process. And this is what our biggest concern is that we've got less visibility, we've got less public consultation, we've got less chance to have our say. And so what we're doing is effectively entrenching the rights of the private property owners. And so the whole system, and we're defunding research. So through a number of little moves, little nicks, they're actually coming together to be quite a serious consideration. Now, dumping and discards. This is a quote from Dave Turner, 2014, when he released the Heron Report, and it pretty much sums up what our concerns are. Shane Jones, another reform that he is talking about, is to legalise dumping and discarding at sea. So in 2022, I think it was under Parker, Labor actually said, you've got to land all you catch. They regulated this change. And that was a direct attempt to address the single species quota management system and the indiscriminate fishing techniques. If you're going to have your ton of snapper, but you're going to catch 2 tons of something else, you've got to land it all, because hopefully that will be a big enough burden that you'll actually adopt some more selective fishing techniques. But because of the discourse between the quota owners and the actual fishermen and how they're squeezing the fishermen out, there's no economic viability for them to change. So the simple answer, repeal and replace. We'll just reform that or replace that proposal, and we'll just legalise dumping and discards, even though the director of MPI has said that's the biggest threat to our fisheries right now. So there we go. I'm jumping ahead of myself a little bit, but effectively what we're doing is we're entrenching the rights of the private property owners, and it's going to come at the cost of the public interest. And we're talking about our kids and our grandkids. The inheritance we're going to leave them, the natural resources available to them, because in my lifetime I've seen the closure of the scallop fishery, the crayfish are gone, the harpooker are gone. We went out fishing last night with some friends, and we were out there for 4 hours, 4 of us, and we caught 6 fish. That was it. So, I remember we used to be able to go fishing under the harbour bridge. We'd fish off the rocks, and we'd catch 1 or 2 fish, but they'd be big, and that's all you needed to take home. The other issue is, or the other reality that I think is quite poignant, is the fact that collectively we are part of something called the Kaiika project. What we do, working with Papatūānuku Kokiri Marae, we work with Hawani Waitatia in West Auckland, we've got another satellite in Wellington and also in Hawke's Bay. We distribute kaimoana. We share fish heads and frames with the community. And it came through COVID, but what we realised is that in multicultural Tamaki Makaurau, the beauty of diversity is the fact that if you don't want those fish heads and frames, you give them to somebody who does. Now, we've distributed over 500,000 kilos of good quality kaimoana over the last 5 years. We still can't keep up with demand. So we had 50 cars out at Papatūānuku the other day. We had to say, I'm sorry, we don't have enough. And that's a really hard statement to make. But the thing is that the community's engaged. The community's into this. We've just spent $50,000 on an app called Free Fish Heads, which was our way to actually reduce the pressure on us. If we can get the community behaving like that as well and making these connections through an app, we're calling it a dating app for fish head lovers. But if we can get the community, on this wavelength, then we're going to win, because better utilisation or maximum utilisation of natural resources is conservation. You use all of the fish, you feed more people. So the fact that the government is now proposing, this coalition government is proposing to legalise dumping and discarding, it's going against what the community wants. So I think the community has moved on from this point. Remarkably, we've been here before. So in 2022, David Parker, he nearly slipped up and MPI pushed it was a technical amendment bill through, and it had something called preset decision rules in it. And it was exactly the same as what these management plans are. 5 years autonomous decision making by the minister. David Parker it took him a minute to get his head into it, but once he understood it, he actually issued a supplementary order paper on the second reading. It was a very 11th hour sort of move. And his statement at the time was, it creates too much autonomy for a minister. It's not, we've got to have checks and balances in here, and having that much control for a minister in the future it's just not safe behaviour. So, we touched earlier on the quota project and how the community's moved on. We just got some polling research from Horizon Research as well that showed even within the New Zealand First coalition or voting base, they don't like it. So, I mean, you can guess what the Greens and the Labour Party said. No, it was more than this, but I thought that this was quite remarkable that even the constituency or the people that did vote for New Zealand First are opposing it. I can come back to these slides as well if you want. I'm not going to talk you through them. I think the numbers really stack up and talk to themselves. So I'm trying to be really positive because, once we get to this point in the presentation, everybody is asking that question, where to from here? What are we going to do? And the key things to start with are really simple. We export about 400,000 tonnes of fish every single year. Domestically, we consume about 40,000 tonnes. Now that 40,000 tonnes is it's commercial fishing, it's recreational fishing, and it's customary fishing. So even on a bad day, double it, and we're still only 20% of what's being exported. So we're pretty comfortable with the reality that we've got to prioritise feeding Kiwis first. That's just a gimme. Like, let's just make it more available. They're our fish, they're natural resources. The cost of protein's going up. If we actually look overseas at all the increasing political turmoil over there, the tariffs and everything else that's being talked about, maintaining access to good quality food seems like a bit of a priority. Separate fisheries management systems. Deep water is the bulk of the fish we export. It's hoki, whiting and roughy. That's it. And that's about 200,000 kilos every single year. Now, it's also the area where there are less stakeholders. So there's less interest from the community. The recreational fishers don't go out and catch hoki. It's just too far. And arguably you do need bigger boats for safety reasons, so there's some good reasons to manage the deep water fisheries differently. The caveat I say is that we've already collapsed the orange roughy fishery once. It's suddenly got an MSC, Marine Stewardship Council, tick of approval again, and they haven't acknowledged the fact that it's a very slow-growing fish, and the advancements in technology means that it's much easier to find these fish again. So we'll park that conversation for another day. But separate fisheries management systems are perfectly viable, and you could cut it off at the 12 nautical mile limit. That means that the community, we've got better access to the fish that is important to us. And the other point is, and this is very much a political one, but we've got to have a rebuild target. So if we can say that we're going to be smoke-free by 2050, if we can say we're going to be waste-free by 2040, if we can make these sorts of statements, these BHAGs, big, hairy, audacious goals, why is there nothing like that in fisheries? Why is there nothing that says we should actually restore our fisheries to a minimum of 50% of what they originally were? Now, to put that in context, we currently manage our fisheries at about 20% of what they originally were, because that's the minimum requirement to stop a mandatory rebuild program being initiated. So it's basically how low can you go, and if MPI can keep it above that 20%, just fractionally above it, they don't have to do any work. The moment it drops below 20%, which we've seen in Hauraki, crayfish, kahawai, a number of other species, snapper, they're obligated to initiate a mandatory rebuild program. So rather than saying, well, we could keep it at this level as long as possible and do it as little as possible, let's aim for 50%. Let's say to everybody, It's going to be a bit of short-term pain. We're going to have to rebuild these fisheries. We're going to aim for 50%, because then if we do that, the conversation then becomes how? How do we actually get there? The fundamental friction that we have as an organisation is recreational fishers always say, I don't want to see a bag limit reduction because I know that they're just going to be exported. And with the bulk of fish being exported, arguably they're right. So immediately there's going to be resistance. But if we could make it really clear to the community that a minimum biomass or a rebuild target of 50% was the objective, and those fish were going to stay in the water, that suddenly placates everybody. Suddenly there's an appetite for this sort of work. So that's why a rebuild target is so significant. Right, so this is the really positive stuff. We've spent, I'm one of the newer additions, Katie here as well. Our team consists of people that are third generation ex-commercial fishermen. They're 20, 30 years in fisheries science. They've spent a lot of time in this space. They've spent a lot of time learning and understanding this sort of stuff. And so at a certain point we realised that complaining about a problem without proposing a solution is called whining. And we needed to come up with an alternative. So we actually sent a couple of marine scientists around the world. We went to other jurisdictions. We went to Faroe Islands, we went to Iceland, we went to both sides of Canada, one who collapsed their cod fishery and the other one that managed to maintain them. And we looked at all these different jurisdictions and we worked out what an alternative to a quota management system could be. So how could we do it better? We started with some principles. I will read these, I realise they're a little bit small, but we realised that what we've got to do is we've basically got to dismantle it. We've got to remove the property rights, because those are the fundamental things that keep kneecapping any proper reforms, any positive change, is the fact that you've got private ownership and a public resource. In 1996, there was the Treaty Amendment Bill. 20% of the fisheries was allocated as part of the treaty settlements to Māori. You can't dismiss that. It has to be reflective of totality. Part of the problem with the 1996 Amendment Bill was the fact that they didn't take any quota away from Tallies or Siminovich or any of these people that had it previously. They just minted some new stuff. So they just allocated 100% of the fishery out and then go, oh, shit, we forgot Māori. So we just put another 20% on. And you can go back through some of those examples. You can see it on the right-hand side, sorry. See where it jumps up? That's the Māori effect. No science. There's never ever been a stock assessment of jack mackerel, by the way. They don't know what the original biomass is, yet they allocated out this fishery, and then through the Settlement Act, they realised they needed to allocate out more, so they did that. And they still haven't got a stock assessment, and it's a fundamental part of the ecosystem. Oops, was that me?
We've got a square in the middle that we don't want.
I'll quickly talk to everything behind it, because if I'm wrong, you can't tell.
Okay. Can you just read those out?
Yes. So basically what we're talking about, the crux of this conversation comes in the form of a buyback. So what the country needs to get comfortable with is this idea that we actually buy back the quota. And it's not a group of good, willing citizens who want to buy back the quota and shelve it, because I know there's people out there that want to do that. It's actually the Crown buying it back. We invested with New Zealand Institute of Economic Research, and we established or estimated that it was worth between 0.76 and $3.1 billion. Now, in full transparency, this was all done before COVID. COVID came in and derailed things for a lot of people, and we're just kind of getting back on. So I think that these numbers are probably inflated now, particularly around things like scallops, because the scallop fishery is now shut. So there is, the scallop quota is tanked in value. The second point is the Fisheries Act will include specific criteria to allocation decisions and encourage innovation. So we're going to give priority to Māori and customer and public fishing. Basically, what we're going to do is we're going to invest in innovation. So we're going to buy back the quota, and obviously that's a big outlay, but the flip side of that is that we're going to issue licenses. and it's going to be issued to fishermen, not to corporates. They can't be amalgamated. It's going to be the fishermen on the water who can apply for a license, and they can apply for, say, 10 tonnes of snapper or whatever they think they need to harvest. And they will then be charged a resource rental. So they will actually pay a percentage of what they land back to the Crown, which will allow us to pay off the initial asset acquisition. So we're creating a revenue stream for the country. What small-scale fishermen are also very, very good at is innovation. They're creative, and if they're going to be out on the water, they're going to work out ways to be more efficient in how they harvest. So we're going to have very strict controls on how they fish. There'll be no dredging. There'll be no bottom trawling. But they are allowed to be creative in how they fish other than the parameters that they're working within. That's point number 3. Gear controls to apply to commercial fishing. Bottom trawling and dredging will be banned from inshore. The contracts or licenses or permits, they'll be fixed term. So they could be 7, 9 or 10 years, and that will be predicated predominantly on the life cycle of a fish. So crayfish, for example, takes 7 years to become, go to a spat to be of harvestable sizes. Orange roughy is obviously 80 years. So depending on the fish, we'll set the time frame of the license. That means that we can actually be very agile with the quota or the allowances, which is ultimately what they're trying to do by getting rid of the public consultation. If we got rid of the private ownership and we had a license, when those licenses came up for renewal, we get to reset on the quantities they're about to be harvested. Independent electronic monitoring and cameras on boats. So pretty self-explanatory. We do need that data. We need to have the visibility, publicly owned assets. So there's absolutely nothing to hide here. And if you're working within the parameters of this, then there should be very little consequence. And the last point is to decentralise the commercial fishing efforts. So if we have licences and they're allocated to the fishermen, you're going to see places like Monganui, Bay of Islands, Whitianga. You're going to see all these small coastal towns that used to have seafood processing plants. They used to have lots of boats going in and out of them, small boats. They used to have marine engineers shops. They used to have logistics and transportation. They had all these secondary tier industries that are now gone. So if you talk to a lot of people up in the Bay of Islands, they all had a family member who used to be a fisherman. And now there's about 5 fishing companies up there, or 5 boats, sorry. Monganui's the same. The only thing that those regions get from these industries is the truck driver pulling up, putting a bit of fuel in the car, or in the truck, sorry, buying a pie and a V, and carrying on. We don't get access to this fish anymore because it all goes back to Auckland or Tauranga where it gets exported. So what would happen with a licensing-based structure is it actually allows the community access back to the fish as well. The critical aspect of that is that if the commercial fishermen want to sell off the back of the boat, they're not constrained to 20 cents a kilo. They could sell it for $5 a kilo, which is relatively to what we're paying in the supermarkets right now, incredibly good value for a protein source. So we're actually creating the commercial fishermen, putting them back in the community. They become a part of the food web, which is something that we want to see, because right now a lot of the community is reliant on KFC and McDonald's, and we're feeding back into obesity and diabetes epidemics. So low-cost protein sources for the community would obviously have a huge health benefit, but from a social perspective as well, knowing where you get your food from and knowing the fisherman that's actually gone out there and caught it is incredibly important for that wider community resilience. So those are the kind of fundamentals of it, I think. So they're based on on a set of principles here as well. I'm not going to go into the detail, but basically what it outlines on the principles is the idea that we've actually got to prioritise the healthy environment. So we've got to look at the ecological structure. We've got to look at the wider ecosystem. Crayfish are a perfect example of this. If you catch too many crayfish, the result is kinna barrens. We don't have a problem with too many kinna in this country. We've got a problem with a lack of crayfish. So if we're going to harvest anything, we've got to take into consideration the ecological impacts of overharvest and the detrimental impacts of our behaviours, and we've got to manage it appropriately. So these are the principles. It's acknowledging the treaty, acknowledging the environment as a priority, and prioritising the health of New Zealanders. So actually giving some value to the social value of accessing protein sources. So that's basically me. That's a mountaintop to mountaintop sort of presentation, I realise that, and you're probably a little bit bewildered, but I wanted to actually make some time for questions as well. I think it's really important to kind of answer everything.
Fish farming, fish farming has to be some part of the solution, given that we've got a lot more people wanting to eat fish and the sea isn't getting any bigger. What's your view on fish farming? Obviously it doesn't solve any of the issues you've addressed, but it's part of the big picture.
It's a great question, and I think you're right. I mean, I've prioritised on the wild fish populations. Yeah, aquaculture has a place, so I think that there's a couple of nuances to that. Shellfish aquaculture, good, really good. And for things like scallops at the moment, we're actually working with an organisation called EnviroStrat, and they've got a very economically and environmentally or ecologically viable way to farm scallops. So basically what they're doing is they're catching spat, and they're growing the spat to be a big enough size to settle on the seafloor. They're releasing about 50% of it, which means that they get a really low mortality rate. So a lot of those scallops survive, and they become brood stock for future generations. So they produce more spat. They then harvest the other 50%. So they're looking to scale that up. So alongside that and mussel aquaculture, that sort of thing, that's great. Fin fish aquaculture is a little bit different, and our primary concern about fin fish aquaculture is it tends to take about 9 pounds of protein to create 1 pound of farmed salmon or kingfish or whatever it is. Now, when that protein is coming from local waters, so they're basically harvesting your jack mackerel to feed privately owned fish, we've got to question the viability or the efficacy of using publicly owned assets in that manner. So there is a bit of nuance there, but ultimately I do agree. Sir.
I'm just going to refer to your really good quote provided by David Pooley about it being linked to the whole economy. I'll speak. I think I speak without that. And I just wondered, you guys are all brilliant, and probably everyone here agree with everything you said. And you said, what our governments do, and I thought, yeah, but how do you get a government that would do things like that? Because all of these things, like you could add it banking, supermarkets, it's the whole economy. And you've heard that wonderful English economist, Gary Stevenson. I mean, he says we need to create a government that will do these things because, it's Sir Peter Taylor. He was knighted by our system.
Yeah.
The system is the
Yeah.
problem. Fishing is just one.
Can I just answer this? I've got the answer to this. You come along Thursday evening and okay, and then in time you vote for a change of government.
I could have done an entire presentation on this. I think what you've just said is very apt, and to be honest, because I do have business background, it's the unsexy side of environmentalism and fisheries management, but it's the thing I enjoy the most. It's very much entwined with capitalism. It's very much entwined with this idea of merger, acquire. It's about building the empire, and it's about not having trickle-down economics. It's about the reality that doesn't work. The only way to grow a business or something to the size of your mate down in Nelson is to actually take advantage of people. And what we're seeing is these ace fishermen, they're being taken advantage of, and they're working harder for less fish, but they're in a captured system, which means that they don't have a lot of opportunities to do anything differently. So I think it is about starting with the economics of it. I think it is about recognising that the private ownership of these assets is a major stumbling block for any meaningful reforms. But then I also think it's about acknowledging the fact that there's a great opportunity for economic growth through better management. So, I said short-term pain, long-term gain. If we actually took the pressure off for a minute in time, we could actually get some really high-value fisheries. Now, I want to go here, but I know I can't. I'll just leave you with a couple of quick anecdotes. We actually have been all the way through the Supreme Court on a similar argument to this. It was called the Kahawai Legal Challenge. So back in 1998, we spent $1 million, went all the way through to the Supreme Court, because at the time, kahawai populations were under a huge amount of pressure. And the commercial fishing industry was saying, please sir, can I have some more? They wanted an increase. Now at the time, they were exporting these kahawai to Australia for cat food and craybait. They were selling them for $1.80 a kilo. Now, we went to all the way to the Supreme Court. Sharon Justice Elias was the judge, and she made the ruling, you must allow for the non-commercial or the public interests. And so she made that very clear. So I think that we've got to recognise that there is a place for economics in fisheries management, but what we've got right now is low-value economics, where we can do so much better than $1.80 a kilo.
He's actually got to take up an argument with his uncle, who's the chairman of the big corporate fishing authority. So how are those conversations going to happen? I mean, I think we're right, we've got to play politics, and we're talking about politics in the voting box, but there's quite a lot of politics that's got to go on where families talk to each other, and little New Zealand talks to big New Zealand, and farm, I mean, it happens in the farming community as well, where the small organic farmer is talking to the big corporate farmer right next door. We've got to create some sense of solidarity for the people who are the little folk in these conversations. And I really want to know how we're going to do that, because they're going to have to talk to some gnarly old bastards.
I like to explain to everybody, and I include myself in this, we all go to sea because we don't really fit in on land. So I acknowledge your point. What we're seeing is the decline of our fisheries, and nobody knows that better than the people on the water. So for a lot of people, they're increasingly anxious about this. And so the conversation about where to from here is increasingly easy, because it's irrefutable that we can. It's harder and harder to justify maintaining the status quo. You've got effectively 1,300 quota owners left. 78% of the quota is owned by 3 major companies, so it's becoming clear. Now, the other example is the scallop fishery. So we started about 8 years ago with the closure of Marlborough Sound scallops, Nelson, right at the home tallies. Then the Northland coast was closed as well, and finally it's been the Coromandel Peninsula. Now, all of these are a perfect example of over-allocation and ongoing use of destructive fishing techniques. Now, when we supported Ngāti Hei to lay the rahui around Coromandel, and David Parker again, he's come out quite a lot tonight, he agreed and he shut it down. Now, the thing that was, we thought we'd won, we thought we'd done something really remarkable. But what goes with the closure of a fishery? The industry. So suddenly all of these people, the gnarly old boys on the water, they didn't have a job because of mismanagement. And it's not enough just to shoot the messenger, because yeah, we jumped up and down and we said we've got to do something. But the reality is the system failed them. And that's the sobering reality that a lot of people are having up and down the coast at the moment. The other one, sorry, just to touch on that as well, is for Māori, they're really exposed. So the treaty settlements that they got, the 20% of quota, obviously that was gifted to them, and that was very valid. The problem is that they can't sell these assets. So for part of Hauraki, which is about 18 iwi and hapu in the Hauraki Gulf, they used to make about $30,000 a year from their scallop quota. Gone. Now they've got an asset that they can't sell, and they can't lease to anybody, and it's just sitting there dead in the water. So if we extrapolate that over 20% of the actual quota, you know, we've got a real problem on our hands. And I think that the reality is starting to dawn on people that without some change now, you know, it's almost evolve or die, to be a little bit crass.
Quota that they're not uplifting, it's not sitting on the floor of the ocean somewhere as a reserve, pending someone harvesting. It's not sitting there unused.
This is where it's nuanced. The scallops are publicly owned. The catch entitlement is privately owned. So the minister has the ability to set the catch allowance so it can go up and down, but without any scallops, that asset is effectively null and void. Sorry, Jeff.
Thanks, Sam. Thanks for all that. And I was going to ask you about the Maori situation, because you mentioned customary Maori and recreation as the sort of priority groups. But some of those Maori organisations are big commercial guys, and presumably a lot of it goes offshore and things, so they're in amongst the big boys as well. So I'd like to just unparcel that a bit. And the second one was the entitlement carried forward. Are they doing that so that they have a bigger quota that they can see the writing on the wall about a buyout, and they want to have a bigger quota to be bought out on?
I'll do that in reverse. I think so, because I know that, Katie's in a lot of working groups, and she has been hearing the murmurings from the commercial industry. Well, why don't you just buy us out then? That's a statement that's being thrown out more and more. So they're realising that their private asset is degrading in value as the fisheries, as the fish are less available. If we look, the 1996 CD Treatment was designed to get young Māori into jobs. That's what they wanted. They wanted to get them on the water fishing. And what happened was that this fishing effort was actually consolidated. So, I can't talk for Māori, and I can't talk for any sort of populational mass, because there's always slightly dissenting views. But what I know from the iwi and the hapu that we work with is that they're really upset with the way things are being managed. We also know that the value that they're getting from their fisheries is declining. So Hauraki is a perfect example. There's less and less value for them, but fundamentally what's not happening is the value that they are getting isn't getting down to the people. It's not getting to the marae, and that's trickle-down economics again. So it's the same but different. And I also have to take my hat off in the same breath to Ngāi Tahu, because they've just said no more fishing of bluff oysters. So it's all very timely that we're saying all this sort of stuff, because it's happening in real time. These quota owners are saying this population is not healthy. We've got to stop. But where are the regulators? We've had it again. There's clearly got an issue with destructive fishing techniques or over-allocation, which has got to a point where the actual fishermen, the guys on the water, the quota owners, are saying, hang on a minute, this isn't working. So it's reaching crescendo point all over the place. And what I think the greatest problem will be is that it's so nuanced. There's not enough people, particularly on the marae and in these iwi, to actually understand A, the value of their assets, B, that they're being mismanaged, and C, that they're not actually getting real value for them either. So it's going to be an education process. I totally agree, but it's important we start with the difficult conversations.
Thank you. That was a great presentation, really persuasive. It's a pity that regulatory standards bill and everything else that's happening now is completely contrary to that, in favour of private property. But I just wanted to ask you about the licences and quota are all for single species. In your looking around the world at other systems, was there, and that because that inevitably creates a bycatch, of course. Are there systems where that can be obviated so that fish that are often found together are compulsorily part of a quota or something like that? I don't know. Can you talk to that?
Yes, that's a really, really good question. I think if we come back to the fundamental first points, which was separate the deep water and the inshore, because there are more nuanced fishing methods within the inshore. Long lining, for example, means that you can actually bring up a fish, and you can release it if it's the wrong quota species, for example. So and if you use a recurve hook, the chances of survival are really high, like 90+%. So you can actually fish efficiently. Blue cod are very susceptible to traps. You can actually have effectively a cray pot, and you can put that down and blue cod will swim in. So scallops can be hand gathered. We don't need to use dredges. We can hand gather kina and paua. Why we can't hand gather a scallop, I don't know. I've only spent my entire life doing it on a single breath, so I'm reasonably confident here. So it's about identifying I think the reality of a single species quota management system is that it's here to stay. No, we can't deviate from that. But we can actually understand the intricacies of the food web, and we can say for things like jack mackerel, kingfish eat jack mackerel. So we know there's a massive bycatch of kingfish every single year because they purse seine them. They have these huge nets and they just suck up all these bait balls which have the predation, the predatory fish around them as well. So if we acknowledge that if you're going to fish jack mackerel, you've got to have kingfish quota as well, that's a nice management. But also just continuing to chase down the efficiency gains or the selectivity in our fishing methods is important.
One last question.
Thank you. I'm glad you mentioned long lining because I long lined for several years and was very happy doing so. But possibly you realise it's the most expensive way of catching fish. And when you come to competing with other people using trawls and seines and sea nets and industrial fishing methods, it doesn't stack up. You can't go long lining unless you get, say, subsidies or help or assistance of some sort.
I completely agree. 100% right. And that's the problem, is that we've got ace fishermen who are getting their price dictated to, so they're obligated or they're basically trapped. They're going to use the lowest cost fishing method possible. What we need to do is turn it on its head. We need to pay the fishermen appropriately, and that's where the licensing system comes back in, because they actually get to sell the fish in an open market. So they get to sell it to restaurants, they get to sell it to the supermarkets, they get to sell it offshore. They get to choose where they sell it to. I've got a friend down in the Hawke's Bay, his name's Carl Waugh. Now he's got, he fishes for flatfish and gurnard. I call it the gurnard effect, because what he's done is he is a small scale fisherman. He's managed to retain 5 tonnes of commercial gurnard quota. He can sell into Hawke's Bay Seafoods for about $2.60 a kilo. That's what he gets. What he does is he's got his old boat, he does about 7-8 knots, and he comes home, he puts it on autopilot, and he starts filleting. And he fillets like a madman, man, he is so good. So he cuts, the fillets go to a restaurant, and he gets about $5 or $6 for the fillets. The heads and frames go to another restaurant, he gets a couple of bucks, they make stocks and chowders and that sort of thing. He even sells the skins to a local pub. They make like a gurnard skin crackling, like pork crackling. He's making $12.60 a kilo by the time he's finished selling his fish. That's what an open market and a fisherman who's actually given the opportunity to be entrepreneurial can do with our natural resources. So it's not about not selling them, it's actually about prioritising a high-value fishery. And the other side of long lining is you get a better quality of fish as well. So you deserve a better price for the better quality product.
You do, but if you're dealing with Stanfords or Tallies, they have a stock price they give you for fish.
Exactly. And that's what's inequitable about this whole situation, is that you're captured by the quota owners, and the opportunity to make a fair wage to sell your product is you're kneecapped every step of the way, and that's why the private assets has to be addressed.
Okay, everybody. This has been a really stimulating presentation and discussion. Thanks for all the questions. So, look, on behalf of everybody, thanks very much, and could you show your appreciation? And just to remind you that fishing is one of the remits that will be discussed on Thursday night here upstairs. If you'd like to come along, if you want to get all the remits in advance, the man over there is called David Keats, and give your email to him, and he will send those to you either tonight or tomorrow. So, thanks for coming, everybody. It's been a good session.
Thank you very much for having me. Thank you.